We begin this morning with the latest developments in the deadly kidnapping of 4 Americans in Mexico.
2 of those Americans, Latavia Washington McGee and Eric Williams, are now back on U.S. soil. McGee was not hurt in the attack. Williams was shot in the leg. They were rescued yesterday in Matamoros, 4 days after gunmen opened fire on their vehicle. They were kidnapped just after crossing the border from Texas. 2 others in the group are dead. They have been identified by family members as Shaid Woodward and Zindell Brown. Now, the state where this happened, the governor said an innocent Mexican bystander was also killed in the attack. And now this morning, families of the victims are speaking out about the harrowing ordeal. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber joins us from Lake City, South Carolina. That is where the victims are from. Ellison, good morning. So what are the latest details we have on the rescue? And do we know at this point, was this a case of kidnapping for ransom?
At this point, authorities in Mexico say they believe this was a case of mistaken identity. The attorney general for the state where this happened in, Tamaulipas, that's where the city of Matamoros is located. He says that this appears to be a situation where you had this group of Americans crossing into Mexico at about 9:18 a.m. He says 2 hours later, that's when their van came under fire. They say that after they were all forced into the back of that pickup truck, then they were moved to a number of different locations. Authorities in Mexico say they believe that what was happening in each of those movements was that the kidnappers were trying to confuse rescue efforts and create a bit of a distraction. So they kept moving them until they were found in this wooden cabin. Again, though, they are saying at this point in time, they are still investigating. One person was arrested who was reportedly guarding the area where they were being held. But in terms of the motivations behind what initially took place, they say it seems like this was simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This state of Mexico, it does have a very high travel warning from the State Department. It's listed as do not travel. And the reason the State Department gives for that is they say because there's a risk of high crime in this area and also kidnapping. Joe.
So, Ellison, we are also hearing from family members of the victims this morning. What are they saying?
Yeah, our colleague Gabe Gutierrez spoke to the wife of Eric Williams. He was the one who was reportedly shot in the leg. According to Mexican authorities, he is recovering in the hospital. His wife confirmed that she spoke to him as he was heading into surgery. Here's more of what she told Gabe.
I didn't know anything until Sunday morning. When the FBI came, everything just seemed so surreal to me. I am very happy that he's alive, but I'm also heartbroken for the other families who can't say the same.
The mayor of this city, Lake City, confirmed that all 4 of the victims here had ties to this community. This has been described as their hometown. Family members have told NBC News that all of them were childhood friends and that one of the 4 was going to Mexico for an elective cosmetic procedure, and the others, a cousin and friends, went with them so they could share driving responsibilities along the way. This is a community watching this very closely and certainly grieving, and we expect there to be a vigil sometime later this evening. Joe?
And Ellison, I mean, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland spoke yesterday, blamed the deaths on drug cartels. Let's listen to that.
Cartels are responsible for the deaths of Americans, and we are fighting as hard as possible. The DEA and the FBI are doing everything possible to dismantle and disrupt and ultimately prosecute the leaders of the cartels and the entire networks that they depend on.
And Ellison, I mean, we know the area is home to the notorious Gulf drug cartel. I mean, do we have any idea at all if that group was behind the kidnapping?
So we don't know specifically which group was behind it at this point in time. Mexican authorities, U.S. officials, they have said they believe this was carried out by a cartel group. You mentioned the one in particular that is known, well known in this area. Sinaloa cartel also has activity activities that take place in this area. Mexican authorities have said they are still in the process of investigating this and trying to figure out exactly who played a role in this and arrest them, bring them to justice. But for now, the only information we have about the alleged abductors or people tied to it is that Mexican authorities say they arrested a 24-year-old who was watching guard over the four when they recovered them. Joe.
All right, Ellison, thank you so much.
And staying at the border, the Biden administration is considering restarting a controversial policy that would allow border officials to hold migrants who enter the country illegally with their children. The policy was lifted 2 years ago by President Biden, and since then, border officials have been releasing families into the U.S. with ankle monitor systems and other trackable devices. The potential change comes as the Biden administration prepares for the end of the Trump-era policy Title 42. In a statement, the Department of Homeland Security said, quote, "No decisions have been made as we prepare for the Title 42 public health order to lift. The administration will continue to prioritize safe, orderly, and humane processing of migrants." NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee joins us now for more on this. Carol, good morning. So I think the biggest question here is, why is the Biden administration considering this policy again, even though they stopped implementing it 2 years ago?
Well, it all has to do with this lifting of Title 42, which is expected to happen on May 11th. The administration has been trying to figure out how to deal with this because there's expected to be an influx of migrants at the border, and that's a huge problem for the administration. So what they're doing is looking at restarting this controversial policy that that President Biden ended at the start of his administration. It detains immigrants and their families at the border for temporarily instead of releasing them into the U.S., known as family detention policy. Now, two sources familiar with the matter tell NBC News that the White House and members of the Department of Homeland Security have been discussing this policy in recent days, having multiple meetings where they're looking at what this might look like, how it would work, and things like that, although no decisions, we're told, have been made.
And Carol, what is at stake here, both for the Biden administration, but beyond the policy, the people, right, for the migrants and the migrant families who are crossing the border?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this is going to really change for migrants coming across the border. And whereas they would normally be, in current policy, be released temporarily into the U.S. with ankle monitoring, this means that these families will be detained at the border, as has been the case in previous administrations. Is the policy that was started by the Obama administration in 2014. It was continued by the Trump administration, and then it was obviously reversed when President Biden took office. And one of the reasons he said that he was going to reverse that policy is because he wanted to have a more humane immigration policy. So for the president, what's the risk there for him is politically, this is a big reversal. Members of his own party are not happy about this. And the risk, further risk, is that he would take a step like this, and yet it wouldn't resolve the problem.
Definitely a major reversal, and it's something the White House addressed, the possibility of this policy returning during yesterday's press briefing. Let's take a listen.
We've been very clear on how we're looking to how the president wants to move forward, and he's been clear from the start, from the beginning of his administration, by putting forth a comprehensive immigration reform. And his approach has been making sure that we expand legal pathways for asylum seekers, limiting illegal immigration, addressing root causes, and also increasing border security. A lot of people have compared what the president is doing as either extending what Trump did or being very Trump-like, and I just want to make sure that that is not what is happening here. What we saw in this last administration, the administration before us, was a gutting of the immigration system.
So that's White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. So walk us through how Biden's immigration goals stalled in Congress. Has he been able to accomplish what he set out to do at the beginning of his term? And also, obviously, this move, as she addressed, has Biden being compared to former President Trump in some instances. So how are Democrats responding to that?
Well, on your first question, the president's goals for immigration policy have gone nowhere in Congress. He put forward a comprehensive immigration plan at the start of his administration. Democrats had control of the House and the Senate. That policy went nowhere, and it's increasingly unlikely to go anywhere now that Republicans have control of the House and we're heading into an election year. As for, whether Democrats and immigration advocates, how they've reacted, look, immigration advocates are saying this is Trump 2.0. this is a terrible policy. This is not what President Biden said he would do. You can see there the White House is very sensitive about being compared to former President Trump's immigration policies. And so at the same time, you hear Democrats, the head of the Homeland Security Committee, the top Democrat there in the House, said that he was alarmed by that the administration was even considering this policy, and that calling this cruel and harmful to children, and additionally that it doesn't work. Now, the White House is sort of fueling this by not confirming or denying that these discussions are happening. From Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary, wouldn't do that. And so this is still hanging out there. And although the administration says, according to our reporting, that no decisions yet have been made.
A lot to watch from the White House. Carol Lee, thank you so much.
The billionaire owner of Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, says that network host Sean Hannity and Laura Ingram, quote, maybe went too far in pushing false claims that the 2020 election was stolen. The comments were made in an email to Fox News CEO Suzanne Scott. They were revealed in unsealed court documents from that $1.6 billion defamation lawsuit against the news network filed by Dominion Voting Systems. NBC News senior reporter Jane Tim joins us now with more on this. So, Jane, even more bombshell revelations in this latest trove of court documents. Tell us a little more about this email from Murdoch. What exactly did he say?
Joe, these documents are revelatory, the widest and biggest picture we've seen yet. This email came the day after Biden was inaugurated, and he's talking about a meeting with Republican senators and complaining that he's getting mud thrown at us. And he asks one of his colleagues, is it inarguable that high-profile Fox voices fed the story the election was stolen and that January 6th was an important chance to have the results overturned? This request from the top chair at Fox Corporation was punted down to an executive who responded about 7 hours later with 15 pages of examples feeding into that idea. This is where we're starting to see just how much Fox executives knew and were worried about their audience, but also worried about whether or not they were telling the truth here.
Jane, another interesting thing to come out of this was a negative text message about former President Trump sent by Fox News host Tucker Carlson. What did that say? And are there any other revelations that we're seeing in these unsealed documents?
You know, these texts are just shocking. One of the things he said, Tucker Carlson texting, I hate him passionately. He's talking about President Trump. I can't handle more of this. He adds, we're very close to being able to ignore Donald Trump. This was, of course, January 4th. The messages that I see in these documents around January 4th, January 5th, with executives up to Rupert Murdoch suggesting maybe we need to say Joe Biden won the election. Maybe that would stop this stolen election myth. Those are almost direct quotes from Murdoch emails on January 5th. 24 hours later, of course, we know Capitol was stormed by a mob, and that myth lives.
And so, Jane, amid this lawsuit, what's the response from Fox News and from Dominion to these latest revelations?
You know, Dominion says these exhibits speak from themselves. Fox is instead pointing to saying what they think is Dominion is sort of cherry picking and misleading based on the evidence. They say the context in these full exhibits, because, of course, we've seen some excerpts of these in the past. They say the full exhibits tell the story and that Dominion is misusing their words. You definitely see a wider picture in these exhibits and perhaps a look at what that might be the Fox defense come this April trial. But it's definitely just revelatory stuff here, Joe.
All right. Jane, thank you so much.
Now to Capitol Hill for what's expected to be a very busy day. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is scheduled to testify before Congress for the second day in a row as inflation worries linger. And he's not exactly offering good news when it comes to those interest rate hikes that he's been teasing. Here now to unpack it all for us is congressional correspondent Julie Sirkin. Julie, good morning. So what did Powell have to say about those interest rate hikes?
Yeah, the U.S. central bank chief with a stark warning for Congress. Remember, he already raised interest rates 8 times over the last year alone. And he said due to hotter than expected economy and the inflation rate still at around 6.5%, that might have to happen again and at an accelerated rate. Take a listen to what he said.
Although inflation has been moderating in recent months, the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go and is likely to be bumpy. As I mentioned, the latest economic data have come in stronger than expected, which suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than previously anticipated. If the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we'd be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes.
Yeah, so the next set of data that they are prepared to receive are on March 14th. The agency then will meet at the end of March to determine how much to raise interest rates by. Of course, that was faced with bipartisan backlash from Republicans and Democrats to this, because this could hit every sector of the market. And of course, with Powell's comments already, investment markets have been jumping at this. We've seen concern from not only the U.S., but also globally to his remarks there, because he suggested that while the Fed raised interest rates just 1/4 percentage point last month, that could jump back up to 0.5 percentage point, of course, concerning lawmakers in the room.
And Julie, beyond economics, let's talk a bit about the political side of this. What was the response from lawmakers to Powell's warning about more possible interest rate hikes?
Well, you can imagine this happened before the Senate Banking Committee. Though Democrats do control the Senate, there were some Republicans on the panel suggesting that perhaps federal spending and Biden's energy policies on this, especially in light of the war in Ukraine waged by Russia, could contribute to this. But you also had Democrats, especially progressives in the room. I'm talking about Senator Elizabeth Warren, who spoke to the job losses that these interest hikes could bring, and the fact that companies were still profiting despite these higher interest rate hikes, affecting consumers and affecting employees. Take a listen to that heated exchange.
4.5%.
Explain that to the 2 million families who are going to be out of work.
We're not targeting any of that. But I would say even 4.5% unemployment is well better than most of the time for the last 75 years.
In other words, you don't have a plan to stop a runaway train if it occurs. Chair Powell, you are gambling with people's lives.
Powell will be back on the Hill today before the House, of course, Republican controlled. So that will also not be easy for him as he prepares, again, to raise interest rates potentially as the economy just continues to soar despite all of these hikes that the agency has already put in place.
And Julie, briefly, while we have you, I do want to turn to another high-profile hearing we're expecting today. The acting administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration expected to testify. What do we think we're going to hear?
Yeah, well, Senator Ted Cruz is the top Republican on the Senate Commerce Committee, where Billy Nolan, the acting FAA administrator, is expected to come before. And I raised Ted Cruz because last week the panel actually had before it Biden's current FAA administrator, the nominee for that position, Phil Washington, and Cruz expressing concerns over his nomination. But look, today's hearing is set to focus on the safety reforms the FAA is putting into place, particularly after 2 deadly Boeing crashes that left 400 people dead in 2018 and 2019. So the FAA is certainly in the hot seat today on Capitol Hill.
A lot to watch in the sky and on the Hill. Julie Sirkin, thank you.
Time for a check on your morning News Now weather forecast.
Meteorologist Angie Lassman joins us now. Good morning, Angie.
Good morning, guys. We've got a couple of systems that we're tracking over the next couple of days that are going to be impactful to the West Coast, the central portions of the United States, and eventually the East Coast. So let's start with exactly what's going on. You see the radar showing some rain extending basically from Texas to Missouri and snow from Missouri up into Minnesota. Here's where we're expecting the heaviest of the rain. Some of these totals ending up 1, maybe 2 inches. So the risk, again, is for flash flooding through the day today. We saw a similar story yesterday. We're going to see a similar setup today. Little Rock, Texarkana, Fort Smith, and Wichita Falls, all included in that slight risk for flash flooding through this afternoon and into this evening. Now, let's talk about the winter alerts. We have 15 million people under them. They extend into parts of the upper Midwest and northern plains, and of course out west into California, where we are tracking that next system to bring them ample amounts of moisture in the coming days. But let's talk about what happens here as we go through the next few days for that system that's going to impact the central plains and has prompted those winter alerts for parts of the northern plains. Here's how it plays out. We'll see a steady kind of snow stretched across the upper plains in the Midwest here as we get into tomorrow. We'll also see the heavy rain continue from the Tennessee Valley into parts of Texas. And then as we get into Friday, we'll gear up for some snow to push into the Great Lakes, eventually the Northeast. As we go into the overnight hours on Saturday, we'll start to see some rain, some snow working in for the Mid-Atlantic and up into the Northeast into our weekend. This will be something that we'll have to deal with. You can see there's a mix of the rain and the snow snow, especially for interior areas of New England and the Northeast. But by the time we get to Saturday evening, that system pushes offshore and we're left with just some windy conditions. Snowfall amounts for parts of the upper Midwest, anywhere from 6 to even 9 inches is possible. So we'll be tracking that. Additionally, an atmospheric river event is setting up for folks on the West Coast, where we'll see ample amounts of rain working in. You can see some of that heavy rain, and even the strong winds are going to lead us to structural issues. Once again, we've seen this play out over and over so far this winter, and there's more to come. Heavy rain and snow possible for the Sierras, and more of that melt could lead to some flooding concerns for folks there, guys.
All right, a lot to keep an eye on. Angie, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.